In June of 2012, an 11-year-old boy from Detroit, Michigan, took the family minivan for a joyride. He reached speeds of up to 90 miles an hour before he lost control, shearing off a telephone pole and crashing the vehicle. Here is a CBS News picture of the vehicle as it's being carted away. The boy was trapped inside but unhurt. The first witness on the scene reported that he was very frightened, not of physical harm that he might have suffered, nor of being arrested by the police. His first words were, "Tell Mom I'm sorry." If his mother was like mine, he had reason for fear because he was about to receive the whooping of his life. Did you know there is a phobia for the fear of one's mother? It's called matrophobia. I suffered from matrophobia. I feared especially the image of my mother with a belt in her hand. I guess what I suffered was, your mama gonna whoop you a phobia, because I experienced a lot of that. I was whipped so often by that belt that I can remember exactly what it looks like to this day. It was about 1.5 inches wide, leather belt, well worn, so very flimsy and flexible, two-tone brown in color, and she could wield it very well. In fact, she raised the usage of that belt to an art form. She could sling that out and snap a running rear end at 6 feet and raise a welt without much difficulty. She was like Indiana Jones with his bullwhip. I imagine that she could actually swing that thing around her head on top of her, and then she could snap it in air and send a chill through a child who was about to receive the business end of that belt. I remember one time she went to look for the belt. I was about to receive a whooping, and I used that opportunity to go rush into my room, and I picked up a Curious George paperback book and shoved it into the seat of my pants. Then I reported to my mother, as was my duty, and when I bent over, I'm sure she couldn't help but laughing, but she recognized immediately what I had done. She made me take the book out of my pants, and she gave me an extra whooping for trying to pull a fast one on her. I also remember in my teenage years, we had come back on Halloween night from trick-or-treating, and we were all gathered around the TV watching something on the television. It was about 9:30 at night, and my dad heard a squeaking sound on the window. He got up and went over and pulled the curtain aside in time to see someone running from our house, and there was a line of soap on our window. Now, let me pause here and cue you teenagers in. Back in the day, Halloween wasn't just for trick-or-treating and gathering candy, but it was also for playing pranks. And one of the pranks that we especially liked was soaping people's windows. We'd take a bar of soap and we'd make squiggly lines or designs on people's windows. It was a harmless prank. It didn't do any damage. The worst thing that happened was someone had to go out the following day with a bucket of water and a couple of rags and spend a couple of hours washing their windows. But it was an adventure for us. Now, there was a code of conduct concerning pranking, especially the use of soap on windows at Halloween. It was supposed to be that you only soaped windows of homes in which you did not receive any candy when you went trick-or-treating. In fact, that's where that phrase trick-or-treat comes from. When a child calls out trick-or-treat, they are saying, your choice, you can either give me a treat or you will experience a trick. And so that was how the code of conduct was carried out. That's how it was supposed to work. My dad was old school. He didn't believe that anybody should be soaping our windows because we had provided candy for every child who had come to our door earlier that evening. So he was a little indignant that someone would be soaping our windows. Dad said, I think I interrupted him just as he was starting. I think he wants to come back. So let's turn off the lights and pretend that we've gone to bed, and we'll open the curtains and we'll watch and see if he returns. And so that's what we did. It was kind of an adventure for us kids. And so we all took our stations. 6 of us were able to position ourselves so that someone was watching one of every of the 10 windows in our house. Mom took up her place in the guest bathroom in front of the bathroom window. She had taken that belt with her. I don't know what she thought she was going to do with it, but it was her go-to weapon of choice, and so she carried it with her. Dad was right. After we were quiet for about 15 minutes in the dark, The window soper returned. But he had the misfortune of popping up right in front of the window at which my mother was standing. And she kind of panicked, said, oh, and then she began slapping a window with that belt. In her mind, she probably was giving him the whooping he deserved. And he was scared, startled, and he turned and ran across our yard and dove into a ditch where he laid until my father went out and found him. And Dad kind of comforted him and calmed him down and sent him on his way. I suspect that to this day he has nightmares about this leather belt coming at his face. That was my mom. He experienced, your mama gonna whoop you-ophobia. As a teenager, later, I had palatophobia. Does anyone know what that is? Palatophobia? It's the fear of being bald. Real funny, God. My paternal grandfather was bald on the top of his head for the 50 years that I knew him. And he always did the same thing to try to cover his baldness. He did a little comb over. But he had so few hairs that he was combing over, you could actually count them if you wanted to. So he had short hair all the way around his head, except for on the right side, just above his ear. He had several dozen strands of hair that were about 12 inches long that he would kind of push over and try to cover his head. And I don't know how he kept it all in place because his head was kind of shiny, like bald heads are. And it was always a family joke that Grandpa thought he was hiding his baldness. And I thought to myself, I don't want to be that guy. And I was afraid that I was going to be that guy. I was afraid I was going to inherit baldness from him. So when about 25 years later, or 25 years ago, I began to go bald, I just simply decided to own it and shave my head. And I've mastered my palatophobia. What about you? What is your fear? Well, we all have some kind of a phobia. This morning we'll look at a conversation that Moses had with God. He suffered from tyrannophobia. That's the fear of tyrants and kings or rulers. He was afraid specifically of Pharaoh. But Moses overcame that fear with a renewed sense of theophobia, which is the fear of the Lord. Through the fear of the Lord, Moses found spiritual refreshment. He was enabled to carry out the great mission that God called him to. 186 times in the Bible, we are encouraged to fear the Lord. Proverbs 14:27 tells us that the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life. It is a good thing. It benefits us. In the fear of the Lord, we find renewed strength, we find courage, and we find the power to overcome. Moses' story teaches us the value of the fear of the Lord. Let's begin to read that conversation that Moses had with God as it's recorded in Exodus chapter 3. We'll read verses 1 through 5. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Some fears we struggle with can damage us. They might disable us, or control us, or limit us. Fear can redirect our life, sending us on a detour that is not what God had planned, or maybe not healthy for us. You remember Moses' story, don't you? Moses was born during a time when the Hebrew nation, and he was a Jewish person, the Hebrew nation was enslaved by Egypt. They didn't have a nation of their own. They didn't have a government of their own. They were a nation of slaves at the mercy of their Egyptian oppressors. But the Hebrew people were having babies at such a high rate that Pharaoh was afraid that very soon the Hebrew people would outnumber the Egyptian people. And if they rebelled against the Egyptians, they might overthrow the government and take the nation as their own, and Egypt would no longer exist. It would now be a Jewish nation. And so he came up with a birth control plan. It was to put to death every male child that was born. It was during this time that Moses' mother was about to give birth, and she was not about to allow her child to be killed. And so she came up with this ingenious plan for his rescue. She placed him inside a waterproof basket and pushed him out into the Nile River at exactly the place where she knew Pharaoh's daughter took her daily swim. She reasoned that Pharaoh's daughter would see this baby lying in this basket and crying for a mother, and her maternal instincts would kick in, and she would adopt that baby and care for it. And that's exactly what happened. And Moses was therefore raised as an adopted son of Pharaoh, raised in the courts of Pharaoh, given a prime education, taught the value of leadership and warfare, and some of the things that God would need for the leader of his people to have someday. God had plans for his life. However, Moses spent most of the first half of his adulthood living in fear. We're going to back up to the previous chapter in Exodus and read of an incident that put fear in Moses' heart that sent him on a detour. It's in Exodus 2, verses 11 through 15, and it tells us the story of Moses shortly after he became an adult. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. Moses was afraid, the text tells us. That Hebrew word for fear in that verse is pronounced Yah-reh, Yah-reh. It describes a trembling kind of fear. In Moses' case, it was a fright which led to flight. He traveled 250 miles away from Egypt to this desert area known as Midian to live there. And he stayed there for 40 years away from his family, away from his people, away from his home. Fear is a powerful stimulus. Have you ever been disabled by fear? Maybe the fear of rejection kept you from interacting with people. You instinctively retreat from social settings. Maybe the fear of confrontation has kept you from resolving a problem. You didn't want to confront. You didn't like the friction, and so you had to live your life walking on eggshells around that person, prolonging the situation because you just couldn't bring yourself to resolve it. Maybe the fear of failure has kept you from trying. You put forth little effort and you are satisfied with mediocrity and realize little success. Maybe the fear of being out of your comfort zone has kept you from growing. You withdrew because something seemed too difficult for you, and as a result, you stagnated. As it was with Moses, our fears limit us. Because of our fears, we are often unable to break through barriers and make advancements in our lives. Moses was trained in the courts of Pharaoh. He learned everything he needed to learn in order to lead a nation. He should have been leading the people of Israel, but instead he spent 40 years leading sheep. That's not what God had planned for him. God didn't plan for him to murder a man and then run away in fear and hide out for 40 years. Moses' life took a detour because of his fear. So God went searching for Moses, and when he found him, he had to introduce himself to Moses. God's intention was to replace Moses' debilitating fear with a healthy fear. For you see, while some fears might damage us, there is one fear which builds us. It's the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord can be a turning point in our lives. It was with Moses. We go on in our story back in Exodus chapter 3 again, picking up where we left off in verse 6, and we read, "Then he," that is God, "said, I am the God of your father and the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob." And at this Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. After this encounter, Moses was a different man. He didn't flee from God's presence as he had fled from Pharaoh's. He stayed and revered God. He took off his sandals. He stayed at a distance from God. He hid his face. He showed proper reverence toward God. That's what the fear of the Lord is. The fear of the Lord made Moses more courageous. And from that point on, instead of living his life in hiding, he had stepped into the spotlight. Instead of living his life as a shepherd, he became a liberator of people. Instead of living his life as a fugitive, he became the great lawgiver of the Hebrews. God had something planned for his life, but he needed for Moses to overcome his fear in order to accomplish it. God has something planned for your life. Don't allow your fear to send you on a detour away from the will of God for you. You see, there's a truth in this story of Moses at the burning bush. That truth is that it takes fear to overcome fear. Moses had been afraid of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. It took the divine encounter with God at the burning bush for Moses to acquire a healthy fear of God. God reasoned with Moses. He demonstrated his power to Moses. He challenged the thinking of Moses, all in order to teach him the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is not being afraid of God. It's to be in reverent awe of his great power. That kind of fear of the Lord is the origin of faith. It's what gave Moses the courage to overcome his other fears. He saw a God who could preserve a burning bush in the midst of flames. He saw a God who could turn his staff into a snake. He saw a God who could make his skin leprous and then immediately heal it again. He was a God of great power. Moses could reverently fear a God like that. The Israelites had the same experience. Years later, they stood on the shore of the Red Sea, fearing the advancing Egyptian army. God had to show them a miracle of great power, parting that sea in order that they would trust in him, and the fear of the Lord would overcome their fear of the Egyptian army. And in fact, over the next 40 years, it would require several acts of God's power to continue to grow and mature that fear of the Lord for Israel. On one of those occasions, when they witnessed the God of great power and were nervous about that, Moses said this to them in Exodus 20, verse 20. "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." You see, the fear of the Lord was intended to replace the fear that they felt when they saw terrible things happening. They grew spiritually through those experiences and learned to face their fears. You probably have done the same. You have learned to fear God, to trust him with a deep reverence more and more as you have seen him at work in your life. Perhaps he has answered your prayer. Maybe he has given you blessing after blessing. Maybe he has provided some healing or some other miracle for you. And through all that, you have learned more who he is, and you have come to a greater fear of the Lord. I used to hesitate promising people that God would bless them in the way that they needed it. Not that I didn't believe God could. I just wasn't sure that he would. But over time, I have watched over and over that God has granted healing to many, provided new jobs for those who have lost one, showered people with the blessings that they needed, endowed the church with every resource it has required. I've seen this happen so many times that now I am confident in assuring people God will be there for you. God will come through for you. God will provide what you need. Isaiah 33:6 promises what our experience with God tells us. He will be the sure foundation for your times, a rich store of salvation and wisdom and knowledge. And then he tells us the fear of the Lord is the key to this treasure. To learn to fear God, to reverently respect him, to hold him in awe and admiration is the key to the treasures listed in the first part of that verse. That's why Solomon wrote in Proverbs 14 that the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life. Moses learned that to know God is to reverently fear him. Let's go back to our Exodus 3 story at the burning bush and dig a little deeper into the conversation between God and Moses. We'll pick that up in verses 13 and 14. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." That is what you are to say to the Israelites. "I am has sent me to you." Doesn't make a lot of sense to us, but let's dig a little deeper. God spoke his unique name, Yahweh, in the Hebrew version of that verse. Yahweh means I am. It is a verb of being. You're familiar with our English grammar verbs of being, right? Is and am and be. They're not verbs of action. They are verbs which identify what a noun or who a noun is. God stated, "I am. I am the God who is. I am the God of existence." As in, there is only one, and I am he. I am the God, and there is no other. He is the great power, the greatest power which exists. And so if we have the fear of the Lord, we have nothing else to fear. Moses learned that lesson. And so we read this conclusion to that chapter in his life in Exodus chapter 4 in verse 20. So Moses took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and started back to Egypt. When he learned the fear of the Lord, it replaced his other fear. Yahweh replaced Yahweh in Moses' life. The God of power replaced his fears. The fear of the Lord eclipsed his fear of Pharaoh. You do the same. Let Yahweh replace your Yahweh. When you fear the Lord, there is nothing else to fear. I remember my great-grandpa Brad's. He lived until I was a teenager. He was a big man, even into his old age. 6'4", broad-shouldered and very strong. I remember baling hay with him when he was in his 80s. We got to the point where the front of the baler, at the front of the trailer where we were baling, and he just I was a young teenager. He picked me up and put me 5 tiers up on the top bale, and he finished out the rest of the load. I was amazed at his strength and his size. But what I most remember about my Grandpa Brad's was his warm smile and his loving spirit. He was so enjoyable to be around. He loved his grandchildren so much. My brother and I used to go and spend a couple of days on Grandpa's farm every summer. My earliest memory of such a visit was when I was about 5 years old. I followed Grandpa out to the barn one morning, and he stepped over the fence into the pig pen, and then he reached over and picked me up and brought me in and set me in the pig pen as well. About 40 yards or so away, there was a feeding trough, and several pigs were feeding there. And so I told Grandpa I wanted to stay and watch the pigs feed while he went into the barn. And so he did. One of those pigs at that feeding trough was a sow with several young piglets. She either thought I was a threat or a meal, because when Grandpa disappeared in the barn, she made a ferocious sound, and then she began to charge me. I froze with terror. I knew that she meant me harm, but I couldn't make my little legs work because they were frozen in fear. I couldn't even utter a sound, a cry for help, because I was so terrified. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there and watched as that pig got closer and closer to me. When she was about 10 yards out, I saw out of the corner of my eye my grandpa leap in front of me. And he raised his big arms over his head and waved them, and he yelled loudly at that sow, and she turned around and ran off. What I witnessed was my grandpa was greater than my greatest fear at that time. From that point on, every time we went out to the barn, I stayed close to Grandpa. Because when I was close to him, I had nothing else to fear. Can you connect those dots? When we stay close to God, we have nothing else to fear. He is greater than anything else that frightens us. Yahweh will replace your Yahweh of all else. And the fear of the Lord will be your fountain of life. I invite you into that relationship with him of reverence and awe, respect, deep admiration, and love for the God who is the God of great power. He is powerful enough to vanquish our greatest fear, which is the fear of death. For he offers us the hope of eternal life. And death is merely a transition into that. His arms are bigger. His demeanor more frightening to a fears than was my grandpa. And he will save us. He will save you if you'll accept him as your God. And we invite you to do that this morning as we stand and sing our invitation hymn.